Good evening. It's great to be with you on a Thursday night. That's part two of V'tov Be'inecha, Eitan Katz's rendition of the Shlomo Carlebach song on his album Unplugged number 3. Nina is out with our daughter right now doing last minute, very important shopping because our daughter's heading off to college this fall, next week. So I won't be able, she won't be able to slip me comments, but also we always share it, the broadcast, to the forum and to a couple other groups, and Facebook is completely glitching out on me. I cannot share it. I'm going to try one more time. It's just what we normally do to share it. Produces a blank window that I can't get past. I'm so frustrated. Normally she would do this for me. Let me just try one more time, and I apologize that I'm wasting your time with this. But some people only get the notification when it's shared into those groups. So let me just see if I could share it using my phone. Okay, here we go. Okay, I think that's working. Okay, I think maybe that worked. Okay, hi! It's great to be with you. Who is with us on a Thursday night? Nancy in North Carolina, Tom in PA, Guy in Ohio, Stephen in New Hampshire, James in Annapolis, John in Maine, Melissa in Great Neck, excuse me, Paula in Chicago, Luis, who is Karen in Northern California, Bella in Florida, Ryan in Jacksonville, it skipped on me, Lucy in Minnesota, Dawn in LA, Paul in the Great Northwest, Chuck, what the hell is that? Okay. Either that's a typo or we'll be banning you from this page. And Shandora in the Bronx. Aoife from Florida. Lynn in North Texas. Aoife, how much more money do you need for your app? We have started. In fact, I just need to get an update from our app developer. We certainly have enough, thank God, to get this process started, and we hope to have an update soon on how things are going. I'll be checking with him. We do need to get our fundraiser going for this year. Thanks for mentioning it. Normally we do that in December, but thank God, I've told you guys before, we're moving forward with our movie. We're making a thriller this year. Nina and I wrote it. I'm directing. We've got a lot of people now on our staff. 2 producers, our line producer, casting director. We're hiring our costume designer, interviewing cinematographers and production designers right now. Our locations manager is on board. This is full steam ahead, thank God. That movie's called Guns and Moses, and it will definitely appeal to this group, and we'll be keeping you posted about that. I guess I'll just mention now, so later this fall, we're going to have to take a hiatus. I think I've mentioned this before. But we are going to have to take a hiatus from this class. I mean, I'll be working 20 hours a day directing the movie. It just won't be possible. So as we've done before, like when I took the 2 weeks going to Israel, this will be a little bit longer hiatus for sure. But what we will do is keep you updated from the movie set and how things are going. And we'll be sharing some posts from that. I mean, just a little bit of information. It's a commercial entertainment, modern American thriller, kind of in the tradition of Knives Out, Chinatown, Fargo, No Country for Old Men. But in this case, it's a murder mystery, and because the cops think they've got the killer of these string of murders that appear to be hate crimes against the Jewish community, and the rabbi of that community is like, I don't think you have the killer in custody. It doesn't make sense that this particular person did it. And since the cops won't investigate, the rabbi becomes the detective and soon uncovers a very sinister conspiracy and some major league bad guys. And he's got to get himself armed, get allies, and confront these bad guys. And that's why it's called Guns and Moses. More about that later. Okay, let's get to this movie will be, I'm not sure, we don't know where, where it's going to land in terms of distribution. As right now it's intended to come out in theaters and then eventually it'll stream like our earlier movies. You've seen those posters before. When Do We Eat and Saving Lincoln. They're available on Amazon Prime and Apple Movies, and I'm pretty sure that this new movie will end up there too. But first, God willing, it'll have a big theatrical run. I mean, we're really, the silver lining for us of COVID was, as filmmakers, we had a chance to really study this genre, the thriller genre. And we watched and continue to watch, but we watch really a movie a day, a thriller a day, every day. All like since COVID began. We had been working on this script before COVID began. And so during COVID, we had a projector and a screen in our living room and just watched a thriller every day. Worked our way through every list of the top thrillers of all time and the real classics we watched repeatedly to study this genre. And so that I can humbly say, as the film's director, there's no guarantee. Who knows how the film will come out. But what we're aiming for is that this film should be able to take its place on any list of the top thrillers of all time. We may not succeed, but that's what we're aiming for. So God willing, it'll be a Kiddush Hashem, in the sense it's a rabbi as the detective, and will represent properly. But also, it'll be a Kiddush Hashem in the form of a smash hit that conveys what we're trying to show and the entertainment of this movie to a huge audience. So maybe please give us an amen for that. All right, let's do what we're doing here today. So we are in chapter 4 here of Tractate Kesubos, the 15th volume of the Talmud. We started this chapter yesterday. Today we're continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 1 in chapter 4, and we'll open Mishnah number 2. And our daf today is Mem Gimel, page 43. We pick it up at the bottom of page 42b. Abaye raised an objection to this explanation of the opinion of Rabbi Shimon above. So recall that our Mishnah here at the beginning of chapter 4, seemingly a continuation of chapter 3, but it's not. So if we had, God forbid, a tragedy in the form of a horrific crime, that a girl was raped, or if she was seduced. So the Torah specifies that if this happened when she was a young woman, not a minor who's less than 12 years old, not an adult, but at that short stage in between, it's called a nara, a young woman, then the rapist or the seducer owes several amounts of money and other kinds of punishment. But in terms of the money, if he inflicted humiliation, degradation, pain on her, those are damages, and he owes those in any case. But if it was rape or seduction, he also owns a Torah-specified fine, right? The fine. Now, the fine is only in the case of this young woman who is a virgin under her father's authority. And the fine sort of compensates for the fact that when it's time for her to get married, if she's a virgin, her marriage contract, because we're in Tractate Kesubos, its minimum value is 200 dinars if she's a virgin, and 100 dinars if she's not. So this money gets paid to her father because he, and think of it the ancient world, he's marrying off his daughter, and she's his responsibility until he marries her off. And that's why these amounts, the fine, in the case of the rapist or the seducer, is tied to the dowry price of a young woman, as it were. So we already knew that. In this chapter, what we talked about was, let's say that happened, right? We're not talking about the criminal law and how we established that, etc. But let's say that happened. Okay, so now that money is due to the father, but then he dies. So who does that money go? Presumably to the daughter. But if it was part of the father's estate, maybe it goes to his heirs, right? So she has older brothers, it would go to them rather than it would go to her. But as we saw, the sages carved out an exception that whereas other kinds of money that would flow to a father get inherited by him, if that money was if that money went to the father's estate because the girl was raped, then in most cases it will go to her because she's the one that suffered through that trauma. And it was interesting how the sages carved out that exception. Okay, along with this, we learned that there's this sort of more complex case. We learned the principle that one who admits to having committed a transgression for which there is both a fine and damages, right? So a fine is not tied to the actual out-of-pocket loss, including humiliation, degradation, hospital costs, loss of livelihood, etc. Those are all damages. The fine is a specific amount of money that the Torah specifies. One who admits to such a transgression without having been brought to court, witnesses accusing him, etc., he doesn't have to pay the fine, right? Because we couldn't have established the crime without him admitting it. So if he admits it, he still owes the damages, but he doesn't owe the fine. What if after he committed the crime and then he was accused by the father who didn't have witnesses that this man raped his daughter, and the man says, no, I didn't do it, and then he even swears an oath that he didn't do it, but then he regrets not only having done it, but having sworn a false oath about it, and he says, you know what, the truth is I did it. Okay, so in that case, he has admitted it, and we didn't establish it through witnesses, so the fine, he's still off the hook. The damages he pays because it was by his own admission. Okay, what if he didn't admit it? And then they brought him to trial. And in trial, he was found liable. So now he owes the fine and the damages because it wasn't by his own admission. But then the court, maybe it's like a mobile court. This was very common. Even Abraham Lincoln served in such a court where the lawyers and the judges would travel around because every town didn't have the means to support judges and lawyers for every trial that came up. So they would just go to trial, when the judge was in town every, month or 2 or 6, whatever it was. So let's say the court came, they found him liable, and then the court left. And now the guy says, you know what, I'm not going to pay. And they say, well, you were found liable in court. And he says, yeah, no, I wasn't. And I swear that I wasn't. Maybe the father and this guy who's liable ended up in another town. And so now the father's bringing him to a different court. And this guy says, no, I didn't do the crime and I was never found liable. And I swear an oath. And then he regrets that he did that. And he says, you know what, I did do it. And I was found liable. So then the question was, okay, well, the fine portion of the payments that he owes, did it, once he stood trial, was that fine now converted into damages and a monetary liability? Or does it remain a fine? So that, once he admits it, does he skate on paying the fine? And we were thinking, that's ridiculous. He was found liable because he didn't admit it. But maybe the fact that there is a fine, right, when you swear falsely that you didn't owe something and then you do, and then it's proven that you do, so then you have to bring an offering for swearing a false oath and add a fine to the amount that you owe. So maybe the original fine of the rapist became a monetary liability after he was found guilty. Then he denied that he ever was brought to court and became liable. But then without anyone else, proving that that actually happened, he admits it. So maybe he certainly does owe all the amount that, he was found liable to owe in that first case, but he doesn't have to bring the offering, right, when the temple is standing for having sworn a false oath, and he doesn't have to pay the additional fine, I think it's a fifth, 20%, for swearing falsely about money that you owe when you actually owe it. So maybe because he admitted it, right, without it being proven that he had lied, he came out and admitted it himself. So maybe that's the portion of the fine that he doesn't have to pay. Those are the issues we were discussing yesterday. And so we picked this up right at the bottom of 42b. Abaye raised an objection to this explanation of the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, based upon a Mishna in Shavuos, in another tractate about vows, which was cited on page 42a of that tractate, which states that Rabbi Shimon exempts this man, as he does not pay a fine on his own admission. And so the Gemara infers, well, the reason that he is not liable to bring a guilt offering for having sworn a false oath is because he has not stood trial. However, if he has stood trial and been found guilty, in which case he pays on his own admission when he later admits that he was already convicted in court. So he should also be liable to bring the sin offering if he denies that he was convicted in court and he takes an oath to that effect. And this contradicts the claim that, according to Rabbi Shimon, even after one is convicted in court, the payment is still considered a fine. It should be that after he's convicted in court, what was a fine is now considered a monetary liability. And if you swear you don't owe it, it's you're swearing that you don't owe damages, right? Because when the Torah says that one who owes money and swears falsely that he doesn't owe the money has to pay the money plus a penalty and bring this guilt offering, right? An offering that's brought when the temple is standing. We don't bring offerings now. But, said Rabbi Shimon, okay, wait a minute. If he swore falsely that he didn't owe a fine, then he doesn't have to bring the guilt offering. And he doesn't even have to pay that fine if he ultimately admits it before it's proven that he was lying. Right? Because the fact that he swore falsely about a fine that he owed doesn't change the fact that it was a fine. And when he admits that he owed a fine, he doesn't have to pay that he committed a crime for which he became liable to pay a fine, that he doesn't have to pay the fine. When he admits that he committed a crime that was for that he owes damages relating to that crime, he owes the damages, but if it had both fine and damages, he owes the damages, he doesn't owe the fine. And the complexity that's been brought into this is he swore falsely about it, or was he brought to trial about it, etc. So Rabbi Shimon says if the underlying penalty for this crime was paying a fine and ultimately he admits it, he doesn't have to pay the fine. But what about if there was a trial in between? So it doesn't really matter that he admits later. He didn't admit in the beginning, and then he was found liable through a trial. So after that, how can you say it's still a fine? After that, he has a monetary obligation that is a liability created by an adjudication, by a court-imposed judgment. That's no longer a fine. That's a monetary liability. If he swears that that never happened, that he didn't stand trial and become liable to pay, then what he's swearing falsely to is not a fine. It's a monetary liability. Right? So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Shimon stated his opinion to them in accordance with the statement of the rabbis themselves, like this. According to my opinion, says Rabbi Shimon, although he has stood trial, the merciful one exempts him from bringing the guilt offering for swearing falsely. Why? This is derived from the verse, Leviticus 5:21, and deal falsely with his neighbor in a matter of deposit, meaning in the matter of a money obligation, not a fine. That's the verse in Leviticus that triggers liability to, in addition to paying what you owe, that you should bring a sin offering. But only when there's an underlying monetary obligation, like damages or a loan, not payment of a fine. However, says Rabbi Shimon, according to your opinion, you should the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Shimon, you should at least concede to me in a case where he has not stood trial, that when one claims the money, he claims a fine and not a regular monetary payment. And the principle is, now we're in 43a, that one who admits that he is liable to pay a fine is exempt. Since the man would not have been liable to pay, even if he had admitted his guilt, his denial of guilt is not considered a denial of monetary liability. It's denial of a fine. And that's different. And that doesn't trigger the guilt offering. And even if he swears falsely that he is not liable, he still does not become liable to bring the guilt offering. And the rabbis hold that when the father claims payment in court, it is the compensation for the humiliation and degradation that he claims. That's damages, not a fine. The father's focus for his daughter who was seduced or raped is not the fine of the rapist or the seducer, but the damages for humiliation and degradation. That's the father's main focus, and therefore the rapist or seducer, when he denied that happened and swore about it, swore falsely, he wasn't swearing falsely about a fine. He was swearing falsely about damages, right? And therefore, that rapist or seducer is liable to bring the guilt offering in the temple, and he has to pay the underlying payment. So the Gemara asks if this explanation is correct with regard to what do the rabbis disagree. Rav Papa said, Rabbi Shimon holds that a person does not leave aside something that is fixed, for example, a fine, and claims something that is not fixed, the compensation for humiliation and degradation, which needs to be assessed by the court. Right? So Rav Papa is saying that Rabbi Shimon is saying that what the father's most focused on is the fine, because he knows that that's going to be 200 dinars, more than he's focused on the humiliation and degradation, which might be more than 200 dinars, or it might be less than 200 dinars. Who knows how that's going to go when it's brought to trial. So the father would be more focused on the fine. Consequently, a claim of rape is essentially a demand for the fine. And conversely, according to Rav Papa, the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Shimon hold that a person does not leave aside something that, if the defendant admits to it, he is not exempt from payment, meaning the damages for humiliation and degradation, and he would not be more focused on a claim that if the defendant admits to it, he doesn't have to pay at all, right? If the defendant admits that he raped, then the fine, he's off the hook, because by your own admission, you have to pay a fine. You only remain liable for damages, in this case, humiliation and degradation. So according to the rabbis, the father would be much more focused on the damages than on the fine. Consequently, the rabbis contend that the lawsuit is mainly focused on the compensation for the humiliation and degradation. And if this rapist, swore a false oath that he never committed the crime, and not only that, he was never brought to trial about it, and he never became liable to pay some kind of money, then when he swore that false oath, it was referring to damages rather than to a fine. And that's why he does have to bring the guilt offering, he does have to pay the underlying damages, and he does add even a penalty to it because he swore falsely. New subject. Rabbi Avina raised a dilemma before Rav Sheshes with regard to a daughter who is sustained by her brothers, i.e. an orphan whose brothers provide her with her sustenance. Now we're back to analyzing our original Mishnah, Mishnah number 1, where this rapist became liable to pay a fine, or to pay damages. Let's say even he admitted it, so he doesn't have to pay the fine, but he has to pay the damages. But then the father dies either before the trial or before the damages are actually paid. So who receives the money payment? The girl who was raped, and our hearts say obviously she receives it. It goes to her father because the crime happened when she was a young woman under the authority of her father, but then the father died. So who does the payment go to? Does it go to her, or does it go to her brothers who are the heirs of her father? So back to understand that law, with regard to a daughter who is sustained by her brothers. The father died, he left older brothers and a girl. Right? So imagine like Jacob, like if Jacob died and he left, 12 sons and one daughter, right? Like Dinah. So in that case, and she's unmarried. So the brothers now have an obligation to sustain her, right? To provide shelter and food for their sister. So if there was money owed to the father because this girl was raped, does it go to her or does it go to the brothers? In the case where the brothers are sustaining the girl. With regard to a daughter who is sustained by her brothers, i.e. an orphan whose brothers provide her with her sustenance from their father's estate, in accordance with the stipulation in the marriage contract between their parents, right, the parents of these boys and this girl, in accordance with the stipulation of the marriage contract between their parents that requires the father to pay for his daughter's sustenance from his property, and now the father died and that property goes to his heirs. So to whom do her earnings belong? Right? In order to understand this payment, we're actually asking a different question. While she's being sustained by her brothers, if, she does work, right? Like they say, we have a sister and she does amazing needlework. Anybody, help sustain this family by hiring her to do needlework. So they hire her. She's a child laborer. Right? She's not yet an independent adult. So these earnings that come from her child labor, who do they belong to? Her or her brothers who are sustaining her. If it was her father, it would definitely belong to her father. But now that her sustenance comes from the father's estate that has passed to the brother, Do her earnings go to their brothers or to her? So Rabbi Avin explains the sides of the dilemma. One might say that the brothers stand in place of the father, just as if their father's alive, her earnings go to the father. Here too, her earnings go to the brothers. Or perhaps this is not similar to the case of a living father. Why not? Because there she is sustained from his own property, and therefore he is entitled to receive her earnings. Whereas here, she's not sustained from the possessions of her brothers, but rather from the estate of their father. And consequently, they should not receive her earnings. They don't stand, even though they inherit the father, they don't stand in the place of the father. This is not their daughter, this is their sister. Rav Sheshes said to him, you already learned the answer to this dilemma from a Mishna in tractate Kesubos on page 81 of this tractate. A widow is sustained from the property of the orphans, and her earnings are theirs. This indicates that although a widow receives her sustenance from the estate of her deceased husband, in accordance with the stipulations of the marriage contract, the orphans are nevertheless entitled to her earnings, and the same reasoning should apply to an orphan sustained by her brothers. But the Gemara refutes this argument. Are the two situations comparable? Is a widow in the same place as an orphan daughter? In the case of his widow, the deceased is not necessarily amenable to her living in comfort. Consequently, she is entitled only to the minimum guaranteed to her by her kesuba, by her marriage contract, while her earnings go to his heirs. Conversely, with regard to his daughter, he is amenable and is interested in her living in comfort. Therefore, he allows her to retain her earnings so that she can have the extra money. Are we going to make some kind of assumption that a man might or might not have been interested in the comfort of his wife, but for sure was interested in the comfort of his daughter? Are we going to make that statement? The Gemara asks, is this to say that the welfare of his daughter is more preferable to him than the welfare of his widow? But didn't Rabbi Abba say that Rabbi Yosef said, the sages established the law of a widow with regard to her daughter, who is also entitled to sustenance from the estate, like the law of a daughter with regard to the brothers, in the case of a small estate that is insufficient for the livelihood of both the girl and her brothers. And Rabbi Abba explains, just as in the case of a daughter with regard to the brothers, in the case of a small estate, the law is that the daughter is sustained from the father's estate, and if the brothers have nothing to eat, they must go out and beg for charity at people's doors, because it's better that boys go out and beg than that a girl goes out and begs. So too in the case of a widow with regard to the daughter, the widow is sustained. If there's only enough money to sustain one person, sustain the widow, and the daughter will have to go out and beg for charity at people's doors. Right? When it's a very small estate, how are you going to divvy it up? Is it going to be like so little that everyone has to beg? But if there's enough for one person that they don't have to beg, give it to the widow, and the daughter will have to join her brothers in begging. This indicates that a man is more concerned for his widow than for his daughter. And the Gemara explains, no, the two cases are not comparable. With regard to degradation, somebody has to go out and beg. One's widow is preferable to him, i.e. if one of them must be forced to go around requesting handouts, a man would rather it be his daughter than his widow. But, by contrast, with regard to comfort, the comfort of his daughter is more preferable to him than that of his widow. Right? So if there's only enough for one person to have enough to eat and the other ones have to go begging, okay, the widow should have enough to eat and the children can go begging. But when we're talking about, okay, there's enough that people have their minimum needs met, beyond that is, quote unquote, comfort, then the father, can be assumed to prefer the comfort of his daughter even over his widow. Where are they getting these assumptions? I don't know, but that's how it is right now in this analysis. Rav Yosef raised an objection to Rav Shesh's conclusion that the orphan girl's earnings belong to the brothers from the Mishnah. What Mishnah? With regard to her earnings and the lost items that she has found, although she has not collected them, if the father died, they belong to her brothers. And Rav Yosef infers the reason for this law is that she acquired her earnings during the lifetime of the father, which indicates that the money she earns even after the father's death belongs to her, that the earnings that she earns after her father's death belong to her. while her father was alive, okay, she's sustained by her father, and if as a child laborer she earns money, it goes to the father. But after the father dies, any money she earns from her own labor goes to her. And the reason for this law is that she acquired her earnings in her father's lifetime, which indicates money she earns after the father's death belonged to her. And what? Is it not referring even to a daughter who is sustained from his estate, which passes to her brothers? But the Gemara says, no, it deals with a daughter who is not sustained from his property, but who sustains herself through her own earnings. Whoa, why did this start? That girl can keep her earnings, but if she's sustained by her brothers from the father's estate, then her earnings go to the brothers if she's a minor. So the Gemara asks, if the Mishnah is speaking of one who is not sustained from his estate, what is the purpose of stating this? It is obvious that this is the law, as even according to one who said that a master can say to his slave, work for me, but I will not feed you, i.e. the master is not legally obligated to provide sustenance to his slave. This applies only to a Canaanite slave, with regard to whom it is not written in the Torah, he shall dwell with you. Therefore, his master is not obligated to feed him. However, in the case of a Hebrew slave, as it is written with regard to this slave with you, Deuteronomy 15:16, which indicates that the master, that the slave is entitled to live with his master as an equal. The master may not compel the slave to serve him unless he, the master, feeds the slave. All the more so concerning his daughter, it cannot be the case that this young woman has to work and give her wages to the brothers if they are not obligated to sustain her at the same time. So Rabbi Bar Ula said, it is necessary only for the surplus. The Mishnah is not stating that the brothers take her earnings and do not sustain her, leaving her with nothing. Rather, the question concerns a young woman who brings in earnings that provide more than what she needs for her sustenance, leaving her with a surplus. It is this surplus that belongs to her brothers. And Rava said in response to Rabbi Bar Ula's explanation, is it possible that a man as great as Rav Yosef does not know that there is an explanation according to which the Mishnah is referring to the surplus? And in his ignorance, he raises a refutation against Rav Sheshes? No, this can certainly not be the case. It's not such a simple explanation, or Rav Yosef would have known that. Rather, Rava said, the Mishnah itself poses a difficulty to the opinion of Rav Sheshes. And this is the difficulty that led Rav Yosef to his conclusion. This is as the Mishnah teaches. Her earnings and the lost items that she has found, although she has not collected them. And Rava analyzes this statement. With regard to items that she has found, right? A girl living in her father's household, if she finds lost items and they can't, anytime a Jew finds lost items, you have an obligation, a mitzvah, commandment, to return the lost items. But if the owner cannot be identified, the lost items have no identifying mark, you publicize that somebody lost something, but nobody comes forward, then you can keep it. But if a minor child finds such things, the one who keeps it is the child's father. Okay? So, Rava analyzes this statement. With regard to items that she has found, from whom does she collect them? Since our Mishnah says items that she has found but not collected. What are you talking about? Things that, like wages that she has earned but have not yet been paid, okay, that goes to the father. But when you're talking about items that were lost, there's no collecting. Either you have the items that you found or you don't. You might say, well, they're collected at the time that you publicized their loss and nobody came forward, and that's when they became his, as it were. But they're not talking about that yet. The concept of collecting is inappropriate. There is no collecting in the case of found objects. Rather, Rava said, the Mishnah itself poses a difficulty to the opinion of Rav Sheshes, and this is the difficulty. Rather, is it not like the case that this is what the Mishnah said? Her earnings are like items that she has found. And just as items she has found in her father's lifetime belong to her father, and after the father's death they belong to her, so too the same rule applies to her earnings. In the father's lifetime, they go to the father. And after the father's death, they belong to her. right? So once again, you see the sages actually creating an equitable outcome. What we would want to happen, they just needed to find, a rationale within Torah law in order to create it. But this is what you want to happen, right? Okay, a child, who's hired out as a laborer, his wages go to his father. Maybe we can accept that because the father has the right to sell the child as a slave. He shouldn't do it, but he could do that. Therefore, the labor that he hires out, that money goes to the father. But after the father dies, are we going to say that the earnings from that labor go to the estate, which has now passed to her brothers? No, we want her to be able to keep any earnings that she made from her own labor. And that is what Rava is pointing to right here. In the father's lifetime, her earnings go to her father. Once the father dies, her earnings go to her. Objects that she finds when she's living as a minor in her father's house. Okay, there's no way to return them to the original owner. So those things go to her father. But after the father dies, they go to her. And we can learn from this inference that the Mishnah deals with the earnings themselves, not their surplus, which is in contrast to the interpretation of Rav Sheshes. So this law was also stated by Amoraim, meaning rabbis of the Gemara. As Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, in the case of a daughter who is sustained by the brothers, her earnings nevertheless belong to her. And Rav Kahana said, what is the reason for this? As it is written with regard to slaves, and you may make them an inheritance for your sons after you. Canaanite slaves are considered like real estate, right? A Canaanite slave, which can never be freed, unlike Hebrew slaves, which were freed by Jews, the Canaanite slaves would pass as an inheritance from father to son. Horrible to our ear because there's no slavery in the modern world. But 2,000 years ago, when the sages were discussing this, and 3,000 years ago when the Torah was given, slavery was very common. So here they were creating, laws of what to do with them. Right? So what is the reason for this? As it is written with regard to slaves, and you may make them an inheritance for your sons after you, from which it is inferred, it is them, slaves alone, that you bequeath to your sons, and you do not bequeath your daughters to your sons. So this verse teaches that a man does not bequeath a right that he has over his daughter to his son. Her brother does not receive the same authority and rights to her earnings that a father had. All the rights a man possesses over his daughter are personal rights, which are not transferable by inheritance. And Rabbah strongly objects to this explanation, that the verse is referring to a man's rights to his daughter's earnings. But one can say that the verse is speaking of the fine that a father is paid in the case of the seduction of his daughter, and the fines paid to him if she is raped, and compensation due to him for injuries that she suffered. And the verse indicates that these rights are not bequeathed to his heirs, but maybe her earnings are bequeathed to his heirs. And Rav Chanina likewise explicitly taught that the verse is speaking of payments a father is paid in the case of the seduction of his daughter and the fines due to him if she is raped, and compensation for injuries she has suffered. Those go to her, not to her brothers, but perhaps earnings from her labor do go to her brothers. The Gemara questions this interpretation. With regard to injuries, they are the result of her bodily pain, and the guiding principle is that any compensation for a daughter's physical pain does not belong to her father, who merely keeps it in trust for her. It might be paid to her father, but he's keeping it in trust for her. Do you hear how in a totally patriarchal society where women had no rights whatsoever, first the Torah and then the sages were protecting the rights of a woman, and how revolutionary this was in ancient times? Even though, of course, it doesn't go far enough. According to our society, it was much further than had ever existed before in history. So with regard to injuries, they are the result of her bodily pain, and even though they're paid to the father, he holds it in trust for her. If so, the category of injuries should not have been included in this list. Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina said, and now we're on 43b, we are dealing with a case when he injured her in her face, and therefore he must also pay for the loss of her value a sum which does belong to her father. Okay, horrific, but understand what they're saying. If a woman, a young girl, was injured in her face, by somebody's negligence or somebody's violence, So the fact that she's now, less beautiful makes it much more difficult for the father to marry her off, right, and receive the dowry. So it's like the father has lost money. He has out-of-pocket loss when she is injured in a way that permanently harms her, makes it harder to marry her off. Rav Zera said that Rav Matana said that Rav said, and some say Rabbi Zera said that Rav Matana said that Rav said, with regard to a daughter who is sustained by the brothers, her earnings belong to her, as it is written, and you may make them an inheritance for your sons after you, which indicates it is them, slaves that you bequeath to your sons, but not your daughters to your sons. And this verse teaches us that a man does not bequeath a right that he has over his daughter to his son. Okay, that's where we thought we were, so it seems like the objection has been handled. Avimi bar Papi said to Rabbi Zera, Shakud said this law. And the Gemara asks, who is Shakud? This is a nickname for Shmuel, the great Amora, right, sage of the Gemara period in Babylonia. And the Gemara asks, wait a minute, didn't Rav say this? And the Gemara answers, one should say that Avimi bar Papi meant that even Shakud said it, right? Rav and Shmuel often disagree, but this is a case where even Shmuel agrees with Rav, that even Shakud said it, i.e. Shmuel also agreed with this ruling. Mar bar Amemar said to Rav Ashi, the sages of Neardea say as follows, the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rav Sheshes, that brothers who are sustaining their sister, they receive her earnings. Rav Ashi said the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rav, that her earnings belong to her. And the Gemara concludes, and the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rav. It was obviously a point of debate for centuries, but in the end, a girl, an orphan girl, right, who is being sustained by her father's estate that her brothers inherited, if she does work, even if she's a minor, even if she's not an adult, but she's sustained by that estate, she receives the benefit of her own labor, the wages for her own labor. Even though had her father been alive, he would have received those wages. Now that her father's dead, she receives the wages. Mishna number 2, here in chapter 4. One who betroths his minor daughter to a man, and the man subsequently divorces her, and her father then betroths her to another man, and she is widowed. The payment specified in her marriage contract, even from the second husband, there were 2 marriage contracts, right? She was betrothed, and then to one guy, and he divorced her, right? We see that betrothal, even though it's not full-fledged marriage, she maybe never slept with this man, but to get out of a betrothal requires a bill of divorce, and that's what happened to her first betrothee. And then she was betrothed again, right? And her father handled these betrothals, indicating that she's still a minor or at most a young adult. So she was betrothed and divorced, betrothed and widowed. Okay, so there were 2 ketubas, right? 2 kesubas. And the payments of those kesubas, the first case was the payment of a virgin. The second one, even though she never slept with the guy, might not have been the payment of a virgin because she was betrothed. It might only be the payment of a non-virgin, but in any case, it was at least 200 dinars the first time, and either 200 dinars or 100 dinars the second time. But those payments, where do they go? They go to her father. However, if her father married her off, not she was betrothed to some man that her father arranged, but she became married to some man, okay? However, if her father married her off and then her husband divorced her, and her father then married her to another man and she was widowed, then even the payment specified in her marriage contract from her first marriage belongs to her. Why? Because once a woman is married, even if she's a minor, once she's married, she leaves the authority of her father. Now, if she was very young, she was married to that man and she returned to her father's house. And then her father married her off a second time, and she was widowed the second time. So the father's the one who did the marrying off, but because she became legally an adult when she was married the first time, the payments of those marriage contracts in both cases go to her. Whereas if she was only betrothed, the payments go to her father because her father retained authority over her. When a woman is betrothed, at a young age, right? For her to have she makes a vow, for her to have that vow annulled, the father and the husband have to join in that annulment, indicating that the father retains some authority over her. But if she's married as opposed to betrothed, only her husband is needed to annul her vow. They're indicating that her father does not retain authority, and that's why those marriage payments, when her marriage ended, either through widowhood or divorce, go to her, as opposed to the case of betrothal. But then they go to her. Rabbi Yehuda says that the payment specified in the first marriage contract, even though she was married, belongs to the father because she returned to her father's house, presumably, and he married her off and she's still a minor. They said to him, to Rabbi Yehuda, if it was after he married her off, even the first time, her father no longer has authority over her, and that's why she receives that ketuba payment. That's Mishnah number 2. Here comes the Gemara. The Gemara is going to do a quick, very short, but interesting little digression. We've seen this principle before. The Gemara infers from the precise language of the Mishnah, the reason is that he married her off and the husband divorced her, and he married her off to another man, and then she was widowed. And it had to be worded this way, divorced and then widowed. Because if the Mishnah had been worded like this, that she was widowed twice, then she is no longer fit to be married. She can't marry a third time due to the concern that she is the cause of her husband's early demise. The Gemara comments, and the Tana incidentally teaches an unattributed opinion in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who said that presumption, the chazaka, is established by 2 occasions. If a woman was married twice and both of the men died, what's the word I'm looking for? Unexpectedly, right? Like they didn't live to a nice ripe old age, but they both died young while married to this woman, and it happened twice. That establishes, according to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the chazaka. The thing has happened twice, lest it happen a third time. We can make a presumption that this is a woman who's unlucky and her husbands die young, and so we don't want somebody to marry her. We don't want her to have a third husband who will also die young. The law is, that is the law, but if someone does marry her despite this chazaka, this presumption that her husband's died young, we don't make him divorce her. He took the risk, and hopefully we were wrong about the chazaka. Also, if her husband's died young, but one of them, let's say, died in a plague where many people died, well, this has nothing to do with her being unlucky, as it were, so that would not, such a death would not establish this chazaka. That was a digression. Now let's get back to our topic about whether these payments belong to the father or not. The Mishnah taught that Rabbi Yehuda says the payment specified in the first marriage contract belongs to the father. And the Gemara asks, what is the reason of Rabbi Yehuda? Why would he say? We understand that if she was betrothed and widowed, betrothed and divorced, betrothed and widowed, that those payments would go to the father because she never fully left the father's household. In fact, she was living in the father's household if she was betrothed. She wouldn't go live with her husband until she's married to him. But why would Rabbi Yehuda say that even in the case where she was married twice, that the marriage contract payment for the first marriage would go to the father? Because she's young? So what, she's young? She got married and she left her father's house and was living with her husband. So what is the reason of Rabbi Yehuda? The Gemara explains that Rabbah and Rav Yosef both say, since the father is entitled to the payments of the marriage contract from the time of her betrothal, when the first husband obligated himself to pay her marriage contract, as the girl was then a minor, or a young woman, but she was under her father's authority at that time. So the father should receive the payment of money for a marriage contract that was written when this girl was living in his house under his authority. That's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. It's not the majority opinion. Although the money is actually paid only after the girl was married and divorced, at which time she is under her own jurisdiction, her father acquired his right to the marriage contract from the time of her betrothal, and that happened when she was a young woman living under his authority. Rabbah raised an objection from a Baraisa. Rabbi Yehuda says that the payment specified in the first marriage contract belongs to her father. And Rabbi Yehuda concedes in the case of one who betroths his daughter when she is a minor, and she matures and subsequently marries, that her father no longer has authority over her once she becomes an adult, and he does not retain rights to her marriage contract. So according to the above explanation, why does Rabbi Yehuda agree? Why would he agree to that? He says that even she was betrothed under his authority and then later marries and divorces, the father gets the money. So why would Rabbi Yehuda agree that in the case of one who betroths his daughter when she is a minor and she matures and subsequently marries, that her father no longer has authority over her? That's exactly the same case as our Mishnah. According to the above explanation, why does Rabbi Yehuda agree? Here too, let him say, since the father is entitled to the payment of her marriage contract from the time of her betrothal, he receives the payment even if she married after she reached majority. Rather, if this statement was stated, it was stated like this. Rav and Rav Yosef both say, since the amounts of the marriage contract are written under the authority of the father, as the marriage contract is drafted right before the marriage, at which point the girl was still under her father's jurisdiction, he is therefore entitled to the money. This explains why the ruling is different if she reached majority before her marriage versus after she was married. In this case, the marriage contract was written when she was no longer under her father's jurisdiction, and therefore her father is not entitled to the payment of her marriage contract. And now that it has been established that even according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, the rights to a marriage contract are determined based upon the time of the marriage and not the time of the betrothal, despite the fact that its sum is fixed at the time of the betrothal, the Gemara asks, from when does the husband's property become liened to ensure collection of his wife's marriage contract? So now that, if the marriage contract was written before she was married under her father's authority, whether before betrothal or after betrothal, the father gets the money. Okay, we established that. But now we're asking, now we understand who the money gets paid to. But how do we make sure that the money gets paid? Right? If the husband dies, how do we know that that money is going to get paid? Can we take his property to pay off this marriage contract to this girl, whether that money is going to herself or her father? How do we ensure that the husband's property is available if he doesn't have, cash on hand to pay this money? What if he sold property and then spent the money? So there is no money and there is no property. Can we go after the property that the husband sold and say he had no right to sell that property because there was a lien on it in order to pay his young bride when he dies and she has to have her marriage contract paid off? Or do we not go after property that he already sold? Was there a lien on his property, kind of like a first contractual indebtedness to his bride over people he sells property to or his other lenders, right? His business associates. Does she come before his business associates? From when does the husband's property become liened to ensure collection of his wife's marriage contract? Does the monetary claim take effect at the time of betrothal so that there is a lien on any property that he owned at that time? Or is the lien only on property that the husband owned at the time that they got married? And Rav Huna said, with regard to the 100 dinars for a non-virgin and the 200 dinars for a virgin, the basic sums of a marriage contract instituted by the sages, she has a lien on her husband's property from the time of the betrothal, as she acquired this amount when she was betrothed. Right? From the moment this girl became betrothed to this man, she had an absolute right to that minimum amount. If she was a virgin, 200 dinars. If she's a non-virgin, 100 dinars. And so that if this guy sold his property, ended up having no cash at the time of his death, that was her property and he had no right to sell it. And she can even go after people who purchased his property and say, no, that wasn't his property to sell to you. You have to give it to me. I own it. I had a lien on it. And that's from the time of betrothal. But with regard to the addition, i.e. additional sums of mine stipulated by the husband himself. The minimum amount, let's say for this girl who's a virgin, is 200 dinars. But maybe she comes from a really good family. And in order to get the right from the father to marry this girl, the husband has to say, well, I'll give her a kesuba of 1,000 dinars. If something happens to me or I divorce her, I owe her 1,000 dinars, right? But then he betrothed to her, and then he marries her, and then he dies, right? And so now, and let's say he sold all his property before he died, and he's penniless. Okay, so the 200 dinars, those are hers by statutory law according to a rabbinic decree. She can go collect that even from property that he sold because he had no right to sell it. But the additional amounts, that additional 800 dinars worth of property, that is not a lien. And she's not going to be able to go get that from people that bought property from him not knowing that there was a lien on it. Because there is no lien for the additions, only for the 200 dinar minimum. So the Gemara asks, and did Rav Huna actually say this, that a woman has a lien on her husband's property from the time of betrothal? With regard to the payment of the 100 or 200 dinars that constitute the main sum of her marriage contract? Is that true? But wasn't it stated that Amoraim, the rabbis of the Gemara, of the Talmud, discussed the case of a woman who produced against her husband, upon their divorce, 2 marriage contracts written at different times, one of 200 dinars and the other of 300. And Rav Huna said, since she can claim only one marriage contract, if she came to collect the first sum of 200 dinars, she can collect that amount even from property that her husband sold after that first marriage contract was written. And if she wishes to collect the one worth 300 dinars that was written later, she can collect from property that her husband sold only after that second point in time, when the second marriage contract was written. And the Gemara explains the difficulty. And if it is so that Rav Huna maintains that the lien for the basic sum and the addition can be ascribed to different dates, that this husband wrote two different marriage contracts, one when he was poor and one a little later when he was wealthier. So let her collect 200 dinars from the property sold after the first point in time, as she was already entitled to the basic sum of her marriage contract from that day. And she can collect the additional 100 dinars from property sold after the second point in time. And I'm going to have to cut it off there because it's very late. I was planning to go 3 more paragraphs, but we'll do it here. And so come back tomorrow to find out what happens in the case of this husband who married a woman when he was poor and gave her only the basic ketuba. And then he became wealthier and he said, listen, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to revise my ketuba. In other words, I'm going to give you a new ketuba for more money. So, and then they get divorced. So what is she entitled to? Is she entitled to the amount of the first contract plus the amount of the second contract? Or are the sages going to say that the second contract, unless it states that it was in addition to the first contract, actually it was a revision of the first contract. And so the second one for 300, that's all she gets, just the 300, and she can only get it from property that he owned at the time of the second one. Or can she say, no, what are you talking about? He owes me, now that we're divorced, 200 dinars from our original marriage contract plus 300 dinars from this later contract. What happens in this contentious celebrity divorce? Find out tomorrow. All right, let me see if I can answer some questions. Nina not here, so I'm scanning the comments themselves, which is difficult. So let me see if I can just find one question or two to do. Okay, thank God, Chuck, it was some kind of typo. I'm glad to hear that. You can delete that earlier comment. Sharon, does the humiliation and degradation level increase when someone denies publicly that it didn't really happen? Does the compensation therefore increase? What a good question. I don't know the answer, but right, it seems like it would. Like she's accusing this man of raping her. She can't prove it because she doesn't have witnesses. He says, I didn't do it. Then later it's proven that he did it. Or he himself admits that he did it. Let's say he admits it. They couldn't prove it in the first place, but now he admits it. Is the fact that he said he denied it in the beginning and swore under oath that he didn't do it, doesn't that increase her humiliation and degradation? Probably, right? But that's why we saw that there's this distinction, a further distinction between the fine that's always paid because it's a fixed amount, and humiliation, degradation, where they're unsure how much it's going to end up being. And there were no juries, right? So everything was decided by the judges, right? So it had to be a based in a rabbinic court of at least 3 judges discussing among themselves. maybe you got lucky and you got a very sympathetic, compassionate judge with a wonderful understanding of the law who would, go seeking to find a rationale in the law to give her the maximum amount. Or maybe maybe her family didn't get lucky and they got an incompetent judge. Or they got a judge, who for some reason, was more partial to the defendant. Who knows, right? So you're not sure what that amount is going to be. And so that you might ask, is the family more focused on the fine or on the damages? Of course, they want to get everything for the girl's suffering. But in terms of characterizing it as primarily a suit for the fine or the damages, this is one other wrinkle in that question. You guys are talking back and forth. Thank God. You're very competent to have a discussion with each other. And I'm just not able to scan quickly. So that's all I'm going to have time for, and we're over an hour anyway. Okay, so tune in tomorrow, the regular Friday time, noon Pacific, when we'll see how did this divorce with 2 marriage contracts go. Does she collect on both of them, or only the latter, or only the earlier?